Welcome back to another scripting tutorial for Roblox. Today we're going to be going over a simple quick method of allowing the player to sprint in your Roblox game. I'll cover how to customize the speed at which your character moves while sprinting, as well as how to assign each button to press in order to sprint. I'll even go over how to make sure that users have this sprint option across all devices, including with a gamepad or on mobile. And with that, let's get started. Alright, to start with, I'm going to run the game, and I'm going to look at my character's humanoid real quick. We can do that from our workspace. And here's our character. We open that up. Here's the humanoid. And looking at the properties here, you can see that the character's default walk speed is 16. So let me stop the game and open up the game settings. If we select the world option here on the left side, we can see all sorts of defaults for our game's world here. You can really create a unique experience by having vastly different settings here, but I'm going to focus on the walk section down here. Here you can see, just like in our humanoid, the default walk speed is set to 16, and it even gives you a nice little breakdown of how many meters per second that converts to. If you're going to be making a super realistic game, you could figure out exactly what speeds you would need to set here, which is pretty cool. I'm going to leave our default walk speed at 16. But I just wanted to show you where you could find that information since we'll be using it later. There's a couple different ways, as I showed. Let's get scripting. We want to place our sprint script inside of the starter player scripts. Hit plus here. And we want this to be a local script since it's going to run on the client or on the player's machine. I'm going to name this script sprint and remove the default print string. Alright, let's begin by referencing the services we'll need to get our script to work. The first is going to be the player's service. So let's make a services section up here. And we'll do local players equals game get service and players. This will allow us to get the local player or the player that's running this script. Next, we need to get the context action service, which will allow us to bind our sprint to a key or button. We'll do local context action, and we'll make that game get service and context action service. I mentioned getting the local player earlier, so let's go ahead and do that. We'll go ahead and do a variable section here. And we'll say local player, all lowercase there, is going to be players.local player. I'm going to leave a comment here saying reference local player to set walk speed later. And now let's set up our actual variables, things that we can change. We're going to start with our sprint speed. Actually, lowercase that first S, out of habit there. And we're going to set this to 30 by default. This is because I just think it looks and feels right. You can definitely set this to whatever fits your needs, of course. We're going to also put in that our default is 30 on this. And then we're going to put in our walk speed, which is actually 16, as we saw. And I will mark that the default is 16. And you basically just want to make sure that this default walk speed is going to be the same as whatever you have set in your game settings. That way, when you let go of the shift key or whatever button is sprinting your character, that it does return back to whatever the default of your world is. Of course, I've set these comments here for default is for our values, just so I can put what I come up with in here, and then I can always come back and mess around with things for testing. So if I want to, set this to 50, for example, to test something out and then come back in and I know that for the actual finished published version of the game, I still want it to be 30. I have that reference there and I don't have to worry about if that's ever wrong. Plus, if I ever see, oh, that's kind of fast, let me go in, I can always compare the numbers. It's just really easy. So now let's set up our key bindings. I'm actually going to make a new section for this. We'll call it key binds. These will be the keyboard key and gamepad button that we want to use for our sprint. Once you set this up, you should have a good understanding of how custom key binding works, so you can conceivably use this method for all sorts of other things. We're going to start with the keyboard key, for which I'm going to use left shift. So we'll do local left shift equals, and this is going to be enum.keycode. And then when I hit dot again here, you'll see that we have access to pretty much every possible key and button we could use for a key binding here. But as I mentioned, we're going to be using left shift. So let me just type in left shift. It's right there. And since some players use a gamepad controller and we may want to release this game on console as well, let's not leave them out and do a gamepad button as well. So I'm deciding to use the traditional option here, which is clicking the left thumbstick down. Now that button itself that it's called is actually the L3 button. I'm going to do button L3, and we do the same thing. So enum.keycode. And then when we type in button here, you can actually see you have access to all the different gamepad buttons now. But we want to do button L3 right here. So with our variables all set up, it's time to make the function to handle changing the player's speed to the sprint speed while pressing and holding the sprint button or key, and also to change the speed back to normal speed when the button or key is released. I should mention here that it's also possible to set this up as a toggle as far as, like in an options menu or something. So when you press the button to sprint, your character is going to sprint until you press that button again. You can press and release it regardless. But that's something that I would leave for full-on options, for player options. So I wouldn't necessarily force that upon people because some people don't want that. So I'm not going to be covering that for now, but I may in the future if I get enough interest in it. All right, so this function is going to fire when pressing the button or key. So let's just comment that real quick. We'll just say fires when pressing the sprint button / key. All right, so let's do local function, and we're just going to call this sprint. Now, our sprint function is going to actually take in 3 parameters: the action name, the input state, and the input object. So I'll type those in here. Action name. Now, in this function itself that we'll be doing, we'll only currently be using the first 2 of these parameters, but we may want to add something that uses the information from the input object sometime in the future, and the input object is passed in no matter what, so we'll make sure to include it there. This is fine as is, but I like to use typecasting pretty often, so I'll do that for these parameters now. If you're unfamiliar with typecasting, I could probably make a whole video on it, but to try and explain it as quickly as I can, typecasting lets you tell the code editor what type of thing any variable or parameter is supposed to be. So for example, let me come up here and make a humanoid variable, and let me actually give it the type humanoid, and you can see that pop up there just by using a colon. And now I could, give this, like I could do player.character .humanoid, but even if I just leave this completely blank, what we can do now is if I say humanoid and I do a dot, I actually get everything that comes with a humanoid, including walk speed, right? So it fills in the autofill on that, which is kind of nice. I'm gonna go ahead and remove this. We are gonna get the humanoid later for that walk speed, but we don't want to get it too early. We'll get errors in our output menu. So another great use for it is you can come up to the top here and you can change the mode that the editor is actually working in by doing -- exclamation point, and in this case I can do strict mode. I can spell that correctly, strict mode. Wow. And what strict mode will do is it's going to check for any types and make sure that if you are assigning a value to those types, that it's the actual type it was set to. So for example here, our action name is actually going to be a string, which is really close. So when we come in here now and I say action name equals test, everything's fine. There's no red lines. We don't get any errors. However, if I try to make this not a string like the number 5, you'll see that now we have an error here with this red line. If I hover over it, you can see it actually says type number cannot be converted into string. Essentially, that's just saying that it is expecting action name to be a string. We gave it a number instead, or we made it a number instead. So obviously that's still going to run everything just fine. The strict mode and all that is really just to help kind of keep your code cleaner and give you less errors when you are typing your code out. It's really great for long, complex code. So with that being said, that long lengthy explanation out of the way, I'll keep strict mode on just for now, just because it will help us write cleaner code anyways. And let's go ahead and typecast our 3 parameters. So our action name is actually already done because it's going to be a string. Our input state's going to be a little different here. We can't just directly say that it's going to be an input state. They have input object, they don't have input state. What this is actually going to do is an enum.input state, and it's a user input state. So that's what we are going to be returning as, or what we're going to be expecting this parameter to be. And then our input object is actually really easy. It's the input object. So that's going to help typecast us there and make sure that our autocompletes are going to be a little easier. It's also going to let us know if we make any mistakes. It'll underline with a red line. All right, keeping with the theme of making sure we cover our bases and eliminate the possibility of making mistakes as much as possible, let's place a check at the start of our function to make sure the passed in action is in fact our sprint action. To do that, we can simply use an if statement. So we'll do if, and we'll check the action name, and we want to make sure that it is sprint. And I will show you where we set up where we're naming the action once we get down to actually binding our keys. So when we actually call the bind method later, we'll get the name of the action. And now we need to check for when the player starts to press the button or key and use that to set our character's speed to the sprint speed, because we're also wanting to set this up to work while holding the button down. We'll then need to detect when the player stops pressing the button. Let's just do some pseudocode for now. So we'll say when starting to press the button / key, and then we'll do when stopping pressing the button / key. So those are the 2 things that we need to check in here. So the user input state, this input state parameter that we're going to be using here, we're going to be passing that in, and it gives us all the information we need to handle this. So it technically has 4 states available to us. We have begin, which is when the input starts, which would be like when you press a key or button down. There's a change option, which happens each frame after begin has fired, and it can be used to detect things like mouse movement or the gamepad thumbstick or triggers being moved around. And then we have end, which is when the input ends, which is what we'll end up using for this. And that's basically when you release a key or a button. And then there's also cancel, which is a special state. It's basically when the input is no longer relevant. So let's say we have our sprint function here, and we're pressing that button, and then we have another button or another action that, for example, when we jump, we can use our jump and say when we are jumping to cancel if we are sprinting. So that would cancel that action. For this purpose, we're just going to need begin and end to determine when the key button is pressed and when it's not. So we'll do that in another if statement. So let's do it here. So we'll go and do if our input state, and we want to check if it is equal to, so we'll again do the num and user input state. And we're going to check if, now we can see them here, if we have begin. So if the button has been pressed down, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to take our player, right, our local player that we have there. We're going to get the character for that player, and here's where we get that humanoid. We'll just do humanoid. And we want to now set the walk speed, and that doesn't need to be spelled that way. And we want to set this walk speed, since we're pressing the button down, we want that to be our sprint speed, which is our variable up here. We have set to 30. Go ahead and move this to the end of our other comment here. So now we want to check when we stop, right? So we're going to go ahead and put that in the same statement. This is going to be an else if. And we're going to say else if the input state is equal to enum dot user input state dot end. Then we will this to be here. So there we go. Now we want to basically, we can just grab this right here. And instead of being the sprint speed, we're going to set it back to the walk speed. So when they let go of the sprint button or key, then we return their speed back to the walk speed, our default walk speed. And that's our finished sprint function. Now to actually bind the function to the keys we set up and make sure that our mobile users have access to a button for this as well. So we're going to call our context action service and use the method bind action. So we'll go context action and the method bind action. And you can see this method takes in a few arguments. So the action name, which is a string, we want to match what we're checking for our sprint function. So that'll be sprint. We need the function to bind, which is going to be our sprint function. This is going to be a Boolean, so either a true or false value. If we want to create a touch button, so that's if we want to create a GUI button on the touch input devices, so on mobile phones and tablets. We do want a function, or we do want a button there, so we're going to go ahead and do true on that. And then finally, you also have your different keys. So let's go ahead and do print, and then we're calling our sprint function. We do want to go ahead and create a GUI button. And now we can enter in as many key bindings as we want here. Now you could just do enum decode, like we did earlier, and then set your, if I want this also to work with the right shift or something, I could do that here as well. But we've already set up variables for those at the top. So I can actually just type in left shift and then comma, and then we'll do button L3, and those are now done. So I do want to go in and make sure that we comment something here. I'm going to say that we're binding function to action. But then I'm also, in case somebody else comes in and they want to add additional controls to it, or if you've worked on this long ago and you kind of forgot how it worked, you can kind of use these comments to remind yourself things. So we can say any additional controls to the end of the list after a comma. So that way somebody can come in here if they want to add, a different thing. They can obviously, variable key bind it here like we did before, and then just fill it in at the end here. You can literally just add as many as you want. Just be careful, you don't want to try to overwrite too many existing key binds. All right, so now let's go ahead and try this out. Let's go ahead and play the game. Output log is empty, so no errors. We are running. This is a speed of 16. If I hold shift now, you can see that I increased my speed to 30, and that's working as intended. If I had a gamepad hooked up, I could also click my L3 button. If I was working on a phone or tablet, I could also see that there would be a button down in the corner, which I'll show here, and that would also give me the option to sprint. And if you want, we can go ahead and increase this to something like 90, something outrageous, right? And when we play this again, so we have 16 and then boom, 90. We are really moving along now. So that's all for today. I hope this was helpful. If you want to keep up with all the Roblox scripting tutorials I'll be releasing, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notify bell. Make sure to leave a comment if you have any questions or suggestions, or want me to cover anything you may be struggling to find elsewhere, especially in the detail I tend to go in these tutorials. My goal is always to make sure that you have the knowledge of why it works and not just copy the code and use it as is. That way you actually learn how things work behind the scenes and can apply that knowledge across all of your coding. Until next time, have a great day, everyone.